there exists a place where the map becomes uncertain, where the definitive line between Scotland and England blurs into something far more ambiguous than any political boundary could ever suggest. This is the borderland, and it is not merely a geographical designation, but a condition of existence itself. A liminal space where the rules of the ordinary world seem to loosen their grip on reality. For centuries, this contested region has been swept by violence, by raids and counter-raids, by feuds that lasted generations and conflicts that knew no final resolution. The very stones of this landscape are inscribed with memory, with blood, with the cries of those who fell upon these moorlands, and in the courtyards of crumbling fortifications. Imagine standing at the threshold of dusk on one of those windswept moors, when the light transforms everything into gradations of grey, and the shadows grow long enough to swallow a person whole. The ruined towers and castles that dot this region are not quaint relics of a romantic past, but rather monuments to something far darker than any history book can adequately capture. These are places where violence was not simply an occasional occurrence, but rather a way of life, where the promise of safety was always provisional, and where danger lurked not only from human enemies, but from something far stranger and far more terrible than any mortal foe. To journey into the borderlands is to step into a geography of trauma, a landscape that remembers what those who walk upon it have often forgotten. It is in these forsaken corners, in the towers where banners no longer fly and where the only sound is the wind howling through broken windows, that we find our focus. Here dwells a creature so specific to this place, so perfectly adapted to the particular nature of border violence, that one might almost believe the land itself conjured it into being. The Redcap is not a wanderer, not a creature that travels from realm to realm seeking victims at random. Rather, it is bound to specific locations, to certain ruins where the accumulated weight of human suffering has created something altogether new and wholly malevolent. This is the first truth we must understand about this being. It is not simply evil, but rather it is the manifestation of evil in its most concentrated and localized form. A predator that emerges from the very fabric of places that have been devastated by unending conflict. The question of why certain ruins harbor these creatures, while others stand empty and inert, remains one of folklore's enduring mysteries. However, those who survived encounters with the Redcap spoke consistently of a pattern, a specificity to its hunting grounds that suggested something far more deliberate than mere random selection. The ruins that became home to a Redcap were invariably those where massacres had occurred, where significant numbers of people had died violently, where the blood spilled had been so abundant and the suffering so intense that it seemed to stain not only the earth, but the very stones of the buildings themselves. It was as though extreme violence created a kind of wound in the fabric of the world, and the Redcap emerged from that wound as a manifestation of concentrated malice and hunger. Those who studied the folklore with any seriousness found themselves forced to confront an unsettling possibility: that such creatures are not supernatural intrusions into our world, but rather expressions of the violence that human beings commit against one another. The Redcap does not exist in isolation from the border wars that ravaged this region for centuries. Rather, it seems to be inextricably bound to those conflicts, as though the accumulated cruelty and bloodshed somehow generated this predator as a natural expression of that darkness. This interpretation transforms the monster from a mere creature of supernatural horror into something far more philosophically troubling, a being that functions as both warning and consequence, both symbol and literal threat. Before we proceed further into the specifics of what this creature is and how it operates, I would like to invite you to reflect on that unsettling idea. If you are drawn to these stories of folklore and ancient places, if you find yourself fascinated by the intersection of history and the supernatural, then consider joining us on this journey by subscribing to Echoes of the Old World, where we explore the profound and often disturbing wisdom contained within the legends that have shaped human culture across the ages. The borderlands themselves form the true subject of this initial chapter, for one cannot understand the Redcap without first understanding the territory it inhabits and the historical forces that shaped that territory into a place capable of generating such a being. Picture the rolling moorlands in the grey light of early morning, when mist rises from the valleys and the scattered ruins appear almost like natural geological formations rather than the remnants of human construction. These castles and fortified towers were built as instruments of control and violence, structures designed to project power across contested territory and to serve as bases from which raids could be launched and from which attacks could be repelled. The architects of these structures could not have anticipated what their creations would become in the centuries following their construction, how the spaces designed to shelter soldiers and store weapons would instead become the lairs of something far more ancient and far more dangerous than any mortal enemy. As you navigate through the landscape of this narrative with us, I invite you to share your thoughts and impressions in the comments below. Where are you watching this from? What draws you to these stories of ancient terrors and borderland folklore? The boundaries between our world and the old world they inhabited grow thinner with each story we tell, and your voices, your perspectives, help keep these legends alive and relevant for communities watching from every corner of the globe. The Redcap stands guard over territories transformed by centuries of human violence, waiting in the shadows of ruins where the barrier between the everyday and the otherworldly has worn thin as gossamer, ready to strike at those unlucky enough to cross into its domain. Understanding this creature requires that we understand not merely what it is, but where it dwells and why that place matters, for the Redcap is not separable from the land that birthed it, and the land cannot be understood apart from the violence that soaked into its soil and shaped its very character. The Redcap is not a creature of indiscriminate hunger, wandering aimlessly across the borderlands in search of prey. Rather, it is fastidious in its selection of domain, choosing its hunting grounds with a precision that suggests something far more deliberate than mere appetite or convenience. The ruins that become home to a Redcap are not arbitrary or interchangeable. They are specific places, identifiable locations where particular events of devastating violence have unfolded. To understand the Redcap is therefore to understand something fundamental about the nature of places themselves, about how geography can be inscribed with memory and transformed into something altogether different from what it once was. Not every ruined tower in the borderlands harbours a Redcap, and therein lies an essential truth. The creature chooses only those fortifications where the accumulated weight of human suffering has reached a certain critical threshold, where so much blood has been spilled and so many lives have been shattered that the very stones seem to pulse with something other than ordinary matter. Consider the distinction between an ordinary ruin and a place that has become home to one of these creatures. An abandoned castle that fell into disrepair through simple neglect, through the gradual withdrawal of human occupation over generations, remains merely a ruin, a historical artifact stripped of its original function, but not fundamentally transformed in any metaphysical sense. By contrast, a fortification that witnessed the sudden and violent destruction of its occupants, that was stormed and taken, where defenders were slaughtered and where the stones themselves were stained with desperate blood, becomes something categorically different. It becomes a wound in the landscape, a place where the barrier between the ordinary and the otherworldly has been torn open through the sheer intensity of human violence and suffering. Such locations seem to call forth the Redcap, as though concentrated trauma generates a kind of beacon that draws the creature to its new domain from wherever it dwells between manifestations. Throughout the Scottish borders, certain ruins became notorious in folklore for harbouring redcaps, and these locations were typically associated with specific historical events of note. A castle might become a redcap's lair following a siege in which hundreds perished, or following a massacre perpetrated during a border raid of particular brutality and scope. The folklore collectors who worked across these regions in later centuries found that the communities living near these ruins possessed consistent knowledge about which fortifications were dangerous and which were merely abandoned. There seemed to be no ambiguity in the folk knowledge of a region. People knew intuitively which ruins were the lairs of these creatures, and which could be safely explored, or even repurposed for practical purposes. This consistency across different communities and across generations suggests something far more substantial than mere superstition or imaginative invention, pointing rather toward collective memory encoded in landscape and place. The castle that becomes a redcap's lair undergoes a kind of spatial transformation in the folk imagination, becoming something more than a building and less than merely historical. It becomes a character in its own right, a place with agency and intention, a location that actively resists human intrusion and that serves the creature dwelling within it. Travelers who approached such ruins reported strange phenomena that preceded any direct encounter with the redcap itself. Disorienting sensations within the structure, feelings of being watched by invisible presences, sudden temperature shifts that seem to have no natural explanation, and most disturbingly, sounds that suggested recent violence, even though no visible evidence of such violence could be found. These preliminary warnings appear to have functioned as an informal defensive system, alerting potential victims to danger before they came within range of the creature's physical attacks. In this sense, the ruins themselves seem to participate in the predation, becoming extensions of the redcap's will, and serving as sentries that announce the presence of danger to those sensitive enough to perceive such signs. The historical record provides occasional tantalizing references to specific border fortifications that acquired this dark reputation, though the identifying details grew increasingly vague and distorted as stories passed from generation to generation. A fortress in the Middle Marches, a tower in the Western Reaches, structures whose names might be lost to history, but whose reputation persisted in folk memory as places of particular danger and otherworldly menace. Some of these ruins may still stand today, their stones weathered and their original function barely recognizable to modern eyes. Yet somewhere in the folk knowledge of nearby communities, the old warnings may persist, passed down through families that once lived in their shadow. The redcap's domain extends only as far as the boundaries of the ruin itself and a certain perimeter surrounding it. The creature does not wander far from its chosen stronghold, preferring instead to remain within a territory that it has claimed through centuries of habitation and predation. What emerges from this pattern is a profound geographical specificity to the redcap phenomenon. These are not creatures of the wilderness generally, or of the borderlands as an undifferentiated whole, but rather creatures bound to particular places, attached to specific coordinates on the landscape, through bonds created by violence and sustained by ongoing predation. A redcap cannot simply choose a new domain on a whim. The conditions for its manifestation appear to require particular historical circumstances, a certain intensity and type of violence that has fundamentally altered the character of a place. This specificity transforms the borderlands themselves into a kind of cartography of trauma, a region that can be mentally mapped by means of identifying those locations where the presence of a redcap has been confirmed or suspected, where the intensity of historical violence has reached the threshold at which something from beyond the ordinary world can gain purchase and establish itself. The castles of carnage, as they might be called in the old stories, thus represent something far more than mere archaeological sites or picturesque historical features. They are active locations where the boundary between worlds remains thin and permeable, where specific historical events of devastating violence have created permanent alterations in the fabric of reality itself. To approach such a place is to enter territory where different rules apply, where the ordinary protections and assumptions that govern human existence in safer regions no longer hold reliable sway. The Redcap does not merely inhabit these ruins, it is sustained by them, drawing power and nourishment from the accumulated violence that soaked into their stones centuries ago. Understanding this relationship between place and creature is essential to comprehending not merely what the Redcap is, but why it exists, and what purpose it serves in the complex ecology of the borderlands and the folklore that surrounds them. Among the many deceits that folklore perpetuates, perhaps the most dangerous is the notion that evil necessarily announces itself through overwhelming size and obvious power. We carry within our collective imagination an archetype of the demon or monster as something towering, something that dominates through sheer physical presence and cannot be missed or mistaken for anything less than what it is. The Redcap shatters this expectation entirely, offering instead a profound and unsettling lesson about the true nature of predation and malevolence. This creature is small in stature, barely reaching the height of a human child, with a frame so slight and seemingly insubstantial that one might initially mistake it for nothing more dangerous than a vagrant or a peculiar figure glimpsed in poor light. Yet within that diminished form resides a strength so absolute and a lethality so complete that size becomes entirely irrelevant to assessing the threat it represents. The Redcap's physical nature embodies a terrible paradox. The more vulnerable and insignificant it appears at first glance, the more efficiently it operates as an instrument of death. Describe to yourself the face of something that has existed for centuries beyond the normal span of any living thing. A countenance that bears the accumulated weight of countless murders and endless hunger. The Redcap's features are grotesquely distorted in ways that suggest a being far removed from any recognizable human ancestry, as though something alien had attempted to wear the shape of a living creature without fully understanding the proper arrangement of its components. The face is gnarled and twisted, with skin that appears unnaturally thin and stretched taut across prominent bone structure, creating an impression of something desiccated and ancient. The eyes burn with a particular intensity of malevolence that witnesses consistently described as among the most disturbing aspects of direct confrontation with the creature. These are not the vacant or animal eyes of a mere beast, but rather the eyes of something that possesses intelligence, purpose, and an accumulated knowledge of human suffering that spans generations. The mouth, when glimpsed, reveals teeth that seem wrong in their arrangement and proportion. Yellowed with an age that defies natural explanation, and stained perpetually with traces of blood that no amount of passing time could seem to wash away entirely. The Redcap's claws present perhaps the most immediately dangerous aspect of its physical form, appendages that represent perfect biological adaptation to predatory violence. These are not the crude nails of a human being, or even the natural claws of any animal one might encounter in the ordinary world. Rather, they are formations of hardened keratin that have evolved over centuries of use into something as effective as forged iron itself. Witnesses who glimpsed these claws before the creature fell upon them reported that they appeared capable of tearing through flesh and bone with equal ease, that they extended to a length of several inches and came to points of absolute sharpness that seemed to cut through light itself when the Redcap moved its hands. The creature can extend and retract these claws at will, maintaining them in a state of perpetual readiness, that suggests an obsessive dedication to maintaining its instruments of killing in flawless condition. Blood seems to cling to these claws more readily than to other parts of the creature's body, as though the material itself has some mysterious affinity for staining and refuses to be fully cleansed regardless of the passage of time or the absence of fresh victims. The Redcap's garb, if such a word can be applied to the collection of objects it wears upon its small body, consists primarily of garments designed for maximum efficiency in violence rather than comfort or protection in the conventional sense. Its feet are encased in boots fashioned from iron or from leather, reinforced with iron bands, footwear so heavy that one might think it would impede movement, yet which the creature employs with terrifying speed and agility. These boots serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They function as weapons, capable of inflicting severe injury through simple contact. They provide the Redcap with traction and stability on any surface, regardless of its composition or angle, and they announce the creature's presence through the particular sound they create, a rhythmic metallic percussion that echoes through the corridors of its chosen ruins. The creature's hands are often wrapped in tattered cloth or leather, bindings that serve to concentrate and amplify the force delivered by its iron-hard claws, transforming already lethal appendages into instruments of focused devastation. Upon its small frame, the Redcap typically wears garments of ancient design and indeterminate material, coverings that appear to have been worn for so long that their original colour and texture have been transformed entirely by centuries of contact with blood and violence. The pike that the Redcap carries as its preferred weapon represents a masterwork of malevolent design, a shaft perhaps as tall as the creature itself, topped with a point of iron that has been honed to absolute sharpness through both craftsmanship and countless acts of violence. This weapon is not merely utilitarian, but rather seems to be an extension of the Redcap's will and intention, an instrument so perfectly suited to its nature that one might wonder whether the creature fashioned it, or whether it somehow emerged naturally as a necessary component of the being itself. The shaft of the pike is worn smooth through centuries of handling, polished by the creature's grip to a surface that reflects light with an almost liquid quality, while the iron point seems to absorb and concentrate darkness rather than reflecting light, creating an impression of something that punches a hole through normal reality itself. When wielded by the Redcap's supernatural strength, this pike becomes capable of piercing armor and penetrating stone, capable of delivering death with surgical precision, or of dealing out indiscriminate devastation depending on the creature's momentary mood and intention. The sound of the pike striking stone, the particular ring that reverberates when iron meets rock, became a known harbinger of danger throughout the borderlands, a warning signal that sent entire communities into heightened states of alert and terror. What emerges from this detailed portrait of the Redcap's physical form is not a creature that conforms to any comfortable category or archetype within human understanding of evil and malevolence. This is not a demon that can be safely dismissed as inhuman or entirely alien, nor is it a mere animal driven by base appetite and lacking in strategic intelligence. Rather, the Redcap represents something far more philosophically troubling, a being so perfectly adapted to predation and violence that these functions appear to be the sole purpose of its existence. The smallness of its body, rather than representing weakness, becomes instead a distinctive advantage, allowing it to move through spaces with terrible swiftness, to hide in spaces too confined for human pursuit, and to retain a kind of invisibility that larger creatures could never achieve. The grotesqueness of its features reflects not malformation, but rather evolutionary specialization, the result of centuries, or perhaps millennia of existence, devoted exclusively to the perfection of predatory technique. Every aspect of the redcap's physical being, from the arrangement of its facial features to the precise structure of its claws, represents an accumulation of adaptive changes that have resulted in the creation of something that is deadly in absolute and almost transcendent ways. Among all the features that define the redcap and distinguish it from other creatures inhabiting the folklore of the British Isles and beyond, there exists one characteristic so central to its nature, so essential to its survival, that it becomes something far more than mere ornamentation or symbolic marker. The crimson cap that adorns the creature's head is not a fashion choice or a cultural affectation, but rather a biological necessity, a requirement as fundamental to the redcap's existence as breath is to a human being. This cap, rendered in shades of brilliant red and stained perpetually with hues of darker crimson, represents the very engine of the creature's continued existence, a mechanism so intimately connected to the functioning of its predatory nature that one cannot meaningfully separate the cap from the creature that wears it. The cap must be kept wet at all times, maintained in a state of constant saturation with fresh human blood, and should it ever dry completely, should the stains upon its surface ever become entirely desiccated and caked, the redcap itself would begin to wither and fade, eventually to disappear entirely from the world of living things and cease its predatory existence altogether. This terrible requirement transforms every hunt into a matter of existential necessity, every killing into an act of self-preservation that the creature performs with the same desperation that a drowning person displays when clawing toward air. Consider the implications of this singular biological fact, for it reveals something profound about the nature of the redcap and the logic that governs its actions. This is not a creature that hunts for pleasure or out of mere malevolence, though malevolence certainly characterizes its nature and its deeds. Rather, the redcap hunts because it must hunt, because the alternative to predation is a slow and inexorable dissolution into nothingness, a fade into non-being that the creature experiences as an unbearable agony worse than any death that human consciousness could readily conceive. The red cap thus functions as both symbol and sustenance, both the marker of the creature's identity and the instrument of its continued biological function. To understand the red cap fully is to grasp that it operates under a compulsion that transcends simple hunger or desire. It is driven by an imperative that originates in the deepest level of its physical being, a requirement encoded not in appetite, but in the very substance of which it is composed. The cap demands blood as a plant demands sunlight, or as the human body demands oxygen, and the red cap serves this demand with the blind obedience of an organism responding to imperatives beyond conscious choice or moral consideration. The precise nature of what constitutes adequate blood for maintaining the cap's necessary saturation has been subject to considerable speculation throughout the centuries of folklore scholarship and careful observation by those who lived in proximity to the creature's domains. It appears that no substitute will suffice. The blood must be human in origin, freshly spilled from a living human being, and the more recent the spilling, the more effective it is in maintaining the cap's vivid coloration and potency. Animal blood proves entirely inadequate to the task, and historical accounts suggest that redcaps have occasionally been observed refusing to consume blood from creatures other than humans, suggesting a specificity of biological requirement that borders on the obsessive. The blood must also be abundant, for the cap requires soaking rather than mere dampening, requiring that each hunting expedition yield not just a trickle of vital fluid, but rather a substantial quantity capable of thoroughly saturating the fibers of the cap itself. This requirement establishes a terrible mathematics of predation, suggesting that the redcap cannot afford to allow extended periods to pass between hunts lest the cap begin to dry, and the creature find itself facing the prospect of slow dissolution through desiccation. Some accounts from the borderlands suggest that particularly active redcaps might hunt as frequently as once every few days. A pace of predation that would seem impossible to sustain were it not for the terrible effectiveness of the creature as a killer and the isolation of many border communities during the period in which these creatures were most active. The act of anointing the cap with fresh blood appears to follow the predation itself in a ritualistic sequence that never varies, suggesting something far more deliberate than mere frantic desperation. After the redcap has committed its violence and ensured that death has resulted, it seems to pause and to engage in a careful and methodical process of impregnating its cap with the blood of its victim. This moment, described in various historical accounts as holding an almost sacred quality in the creature's behavior, represents the consummation of the hunt and the fulfillment of the biological imperative that drives all redcap behavior. The creature seems to derive satisfaction from this moment, a culmination that transforms violence into continuation, that converts the shedding of human blood into the maintenance of the creature's own existence. This ritualistic aspect of the behavior reveals something deeply troubling about the nature of the creature's consciousness. This is not mere animal reflex, but rather something approaching ceremony, a deliberate acknowledgement of the connection between predation and survival that suggests a level of awareness and intentionality that borders on the philosophical. The terrible irony embedded within this biological requirement is that the redcap can never be satisfied, never achieve a state of completion or rest in which its fundamental needs have been met with permanent finality. The cap dries, the blood eventually becomes inert, loses its vital properties, and ceases to sustain the creature's existence. Therefore, the redcap is condemned to an eternal cycle of hunting and feeding, bound to a treadmill of violence and predation from which there is no escape and no respite. It cannot retire from the hunt, cannot choose to abandon its predatory nature and live quietly in its chosen ruin. The very structure of its existence forbids such cessation. This endless necessity creates a creature that is simultaneously trapped and supremely dangerous. An entity that must continue to hunt regardless of whether suitable victims present themselves, regardless of the risks involved in pursuing prey, regardless of any consideration other than the imperative to maintain the saturation of its crimson crown. The redcap thus becomes a kind of tragic figure, a being locked into a pattern of behavior that guarantees continued violence and continued predation, but which offers no prospect of eventual peace or resolution. The cap demands its tribute of blood perpetually, and the creature has no choice but to provide it, an arrangement that defines the essential tragedy of the redcap's existence, and that explains the particular intensity and relentlessness with which it pursues its hunting across the borderlands. Throughout history, humans have understood intuitively that certain materials possess properties beyond the merely physical, that some substances carry within them associations and powers that transcend their simple material composition. Iron holds a particular place in this human understanding, functioning simultaneously as a practical tool and as a substance laden with symbolic resonance that reaches deep into the cultural consciousness of peoples across the European continent. The redcap's relationship with iron represents something far more profound than mere practical utility. Rather, the creature has equipped itself with instruments fashioned from this material as though drawn to it by instinct or compulsion, as though iron itself possesses properties that amplify and concentrate the creature's natural predatory abilities into something even more formidable and terrible. The arsenal that the redcap carries is not haphazardly assembled, but rather represents the accumulated result of centuries of refinement and optimization, a carefully curated collection of implements, each specifically designed to maximize efficiency in the pursuit of violence and the harvesting of blood. Every component of this arsenal serves multiple purposes simultaneously, functioning on practical and symbolic registers that interweave in ways that suggest deliberate intentionality on the part of the creature that wields them. Begin with the boots that encase the Redcap's small feet, implements fashioned from leather so ancient that its original composition has become uncertain, reinforced and bound with bands and plating of iron that have been worn smooth through centuries of contact with stone and earth. These are not footwear designed for comfort or for protection in any conventional sense. Rather, they represent a weaponization of the lower leg itself, a transformation of the feet into instruments capable of delivering devastating impact through simple contact. The iron plating upon these boots has been worked to a state of terrible sharpness along its edges, creating surfaces that can cut through flesh as readily as any blade, while the soles have been treated in ways that seem to prevent any noise that might warn potential victims of the creature's approach. The weight of these boots would seem prohibitive to human wearers, would impose a burden that would slow movement and require constant adjustment. Yet the Redcap moves in them with terrible grace and speed, as though the iron itself has become an extension of the creature's body rather than an external accoutrement that must be consciously managed. When the Redcap walks, the rhythmic percussion of these boots announces its presence with a particular metallic ringing that echoes through abandoned corridors and across stone courtyards, a sound that has become synonymous with danger throughout the folklore of the borderlands, and that sends immediate terror through any human being who recognizes what that particular signature of sound portends. The pike represents the primary and most deliberate killing tool within the Redcap's arsenal, a weapon so perfectly suited to the creature's nature and function that one might question whether it was fashioned by human hands or whether it emerged through some process of supernatural growth and development unique to the creature itself. The shaft of this pike rises to a height nearly equal to that of the creature that wields it, constructed from wood of unknown species and composition, polished through centuries of use to a surface as smooth as glass and as hard as stone. The wood seems to have absorbed the substance of the blood that has repeatedly soaked into it, taking on a discoloration that no amount of time could seem to erase, a permanent staining that suggests the wood itself has been altered at some fundamental level by countless acts of violence and death. The iron point that crowns the shaft of this pike has been honed to absolute sharpness through both skilled craftsmanship and the grinding action of repeated contact with human flesh and bone. This is a point that seems to punch through the world itself when thrust forward with the full supernatural strength of the Redcap's arm. When this pike strikes stone, the sound generated reverberates through surrounding structures with an intensity that seems disproportionate to the physical impact alone, as though the strike itself creates ripples in reality that extend far beyond the mere contact of iron and rock. Yet perhaps the most terrible weapons that the Redcap possesses are not external implements that must be wielded and managed, but rather organic formations that constitute integral components of its physical body. The claws that extend from the creature's hands function as weapons so complete in their design and so devastating in their application that the pike and boots pale into secondary importance when compared to their predatory effectiveness. These formations of hardened keratin have been honed through centuries of violent use into implements that can pierce through armor and penetrate deeply into human flesh without resistance or impediment. The Redcap maintains these claws in a state of obsessive perfection, sharpening them through means that remain unclear, but that appear to involve some process of ritual or specialized technique passed down through whatever genealogy or reproduction pattern generates new redcaps. When extended fully, these claws can reach lengths of several inches, transforming the creature's hands into instruments of such lethality that even casual contact can inflict wounds of terrible severity. A single swipe from these claws can remove strips of flesh, can sever tendons and major blood vessels, and can transform a human being into a bleeding and helpless victim within seconds of contact. The synergistic relationship among these various weapons creates something far more devastating than any single component could achieve in isolation. The redcap approaches its prey armed with multiple modes of attack, capable of striking from distance through the use of the pike, capable of delivering crushing blows and cutting wounds through its iron-shod boots, and capable of inflicting wounds of surgical precision and horrifying depth through the application of its natural claws. This variety of offensive capability means that the creature can adapt its attack methodology to any particular circumstances, responding to the defensive posture or movement of its prey by shifting between different weapons in ways that preserve its advantage and maintain its predatory momentum. A victim attempting to flee finds itself pursued by boots that strike with terrible force and speed. A victim attempting to fight back faces a pike that maintains distance while delivering penetrating wounds. A victim attempting to grapple discovers claws that render such close contact, a pathway to rapid incapacitation through blood loss and shock. The cumulative effect of this arsenal is that the redcap operates as an apex predator of such absolute effectiveness that human beings in its chosen domain possess almost no realistic prospect of successful defense or escape. The supernatural strength with which the redcap wields these weapons transforms their already devastating effectiveness into something approaching absolute and transcendent lethality. The creature is capable of hurling boulders of enormous size with the apparent ease that a human might toss a pebble, suggesting musculature and bone density that far exceed any natural configuration found in creatures of comparable size. When the pike is thrust forward, it moves with acceleration that makes human perception struggle to follow the movement, arriving at its target with force sufficient to penetrate deeply into whatever obstacle it encounters. The boots strike with impact, sufficient to crack stone and to smash through wooden structures that would require human tools and considerable time to demolish through conventional means. This synthesis of specialized weapons and supernatural strength creates an asymmetrical predatory relationship so absolute in its nature that it approaches the level of the inexorable. A situation in which the human prey possesses almost no meaningful options beyond acceptance of inevitable death. The hunting patterns of the redcap reveal something profound about the creature's strategic intelligence and its understanding of human behavior and vulnerability. This is not a creature that operates through mindless aggression or through the random strikes of a beast driven solely by appetite and lacking in intentional design. Rather, the redcap hunts with calculation and patience, employing tactics refined through centuries of predatory experience into a methodology so effective and so refined that it borders on the surgical in its precision and execution. Every stage of the hunting process serves a specific function within an overall strategy designed to maximize the probability of success while minimizing the expenditure of effort and the incurrence of unnecessary risk. The creature understands the terrain of its chosen domain with absolute perfection, knows every passageway and hidden alcove within its ruined stronghold, and possesses an almost supernatural ability to position itself in locations where approaching prey will be most vulnerable to attack. To understand how the redcap hunts is therefore to gain insight into the nature of intelligent predation itself. to recognize that malevolence can be accompanied by a terrible and meticulous competence that makes the threat it represents all the more formidable and inescapable. The hunting sequence begins with waiting, a phase in which the Redcap stations itself within its chosen ruins and maintains a state of perpetual alertness, sensing the approach of potential victims through means that may involve sight, hearing, or some sense entirely foreign to human consciousness, and therefore not amenable to rational explanation or categorization. The creature seems to possess an ability to detect the presence of living humans at considerable distance, an awareness that transcends the normal limitations of sensory perception, and that suggests either a refinement of ordinary senses to a degree of extraordinary sensitivity, or the possession of entirely different modes of perception unavailable to human consciousness. Once the Redcap has detected the presence of a potential victim, it enters a phase of careful observation and assessment, gathering information about its prey through patient monitoring conducted from positions of concealment and advantage. This observation phase may extend for considerable duration, allowing the creature to establish patterns regarding the victim's movement, to identify the victim's particular vulnerabilities and defensive capabilities, and to determine the optimal moment and location for the transition from observation into active predation. The Redcap seems to understand instinctively how fear operates in human consciousness, seems to recognize that allowing a victim to experience growing awareness of unseen danger increases the likelihood of panic responses that will impair the victim's ability to mount an effective defense or to execute a successful escape. The stalking phase begins as the Redcap gradually draws closer to its intended victim, moving through the spaces of the ruined fortification with a terrible grace that allows it to maintain concealment while simultaneously reducing the distance between predator and prey with inexorable consistency. The creature moves with a precision that suggests profound familiarity with every detail of its environment. It understands where the stone will hold weight silently and where footfalls will echo audibly, knows the precise angle at which light penetrates through broken windows, and can position itself to remain in shadow even in partially illuminated spaces. During this phase, the Redcap often seems to allow its victim fleeting glimpses of its presence, permitting moments in which the prey becomes aware that something is pursuing it, seems to understand that communicating the presence of danger through these partial revelations serves to enhance the psychological destabilization of the victim and to push it toward irrational choices that will ultimately facilitate the predator's advantage. Some accounts suggest that the Redcap takes something approaching pleasure from this phase of the hunt, that it derives satisfaction from the extension of pursuit over greater durations and through more elaborate movements than would be strictly necessary if efficiency were the creature's sole consideration. The stalking phase transforms the ruin itself into an arena of predation, converts the familiar stone and shadows into a labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient the prey, while the predator moves through it with absolute confidence and control. The moment of transition from stalking to active assault arrives with terrible suddenness, a shift from patient and methodical pursuit into explosive violence that overwhelms through sheer velocity and overwhelming force. The Redcap emerges from concealment with speed that human perception struggles to follow, moving from stillness into motion in ways that seem to violate normal constraints of acceleration and momentum. In this moment, the creature unleashes its arsenal with terrible precision, employing whatever combination of weapons seems most appropriate to the particular circumstances and the specific positioning of its victim relative to the available space and environmental features. Some victims report sensation of impact before they understood that they had been attacked, find themselves injured and bleeding without clear memory of the moment in which the Redcap crossed the final distance and delivered its blow. Others experience a sequence of strikes so rapid in succession that individual moments blur together into an impression of simultaneous assault from multiple directions, an overwhelming onslaught that makes coherent thought or coordinated defense impossible. The assault phase of the hunt typically reaches its conclusion with devastating swiftness. Within seconds, or at most within moments, the victim is incapacitated, rendered helpless through injury and shock, and positioned in a state where further resistance becomes physically impossible and escape becomes a prospect beyond realistic hope. Once the violence of the hunt has reached its culmination, and once the victim has been rendered unable to offer further resistance or to mount any meaningful threat, the Redcap seems to enter an entirely different mode of behavior, a transition into ritual that possesses an almost ceremonial quality in its deliberateness and precision. The creature approaches the body of its victim with care and attentiveness, seems to examine the wounds it has inflicted as though assessing their adequacy and their effectiveness in terms of blood yield and the opportunities they present for the next phase of the predatory sequence. The Redcap begins a process of harvesting, a careful collection and concentration of the blood that has been spilled through the wounding process, employing techniques that remain obscure to those who have attempted to document or understand them, but that appear designed to capture and preserve the maximum quantity of available blood in forms that can be effectively utilized for the saturation of the crimson cap. This phase represents the true culmination of the hunt, the moment toward which all preceding stages have been directed, the consummation of predation and the fulfillment of the biological imperative that drives the Redcap's existence. The creature seems to achieve a kind of completion in this moment, a satisfaction that transcends mere physical necessity and that suggests something deeper, more profound, almost approaching the emotional or spiritual satisfaction that human beings experience when fundamental needs have been met with perfect adequacy. Across the borderlands of Scotland, the creature we have been discussing under the name of Redcap has carried many other designations, each name emerging from different communities and different periods of history, each carrying within it particular nuances of meaning and cultural resonance that reflect the specific relationship between a locality and the predator that haunted its territory. Names function not merely as labels, but as repositories of cultural knowledge, as vessels containing accumulated wisdom about the nature of the beings they identify and the particular characteristics that make them distinctive and memorable within the consciousness of communities that fear and respect them. The study of these various names reveals patterns and connections that illuminate the geographical extent of the creature's presence and suggests something profound about how folklore evolves and adapts as it passes between different communities and across generations. To explore the names by which the Redcap has been known is therefore to undertake a kind of linguistic archaeology, excavating through layers of language and tradition to uncover deeper truths about the creature's nature and the societies that generated and perpetuated the stories surrounding it. The most prominent and widely recognized of these names across the Scottish borders is Redcap itself, a designation that emphasizes the creature's most distinctive and essential characteristic: the crimson cap that must be perpetually maintained through blood and that serves as the physical manifestation of its predatory imperative. Yet, in certain regions of the Scottish borders, particularly in areas where isolation from central authority had created distinctive local traditions, and where communities maintained their own systems of folklore transmission, alternative names emerged and became standardized within local usage and local memory. Among these regional designations, Dunter appears with particular frequency throughout historical records and folklore collections, a name whose etymology remains uncertain, but which seems to carry within it associations of striking or of impact. suggesting the creature's method of predation and the violent percussion that announces its presence through the corridors of its chosen ruins. The name Dunter seems to have been employed particularly in the western reaches of the borderlands, in areas closer to the Irish Sea and more removed from the direct political authority of Edinburgh or London, regions where folk traditions maintain particular independence and particularity. Those who use the name Dunter in their descriptions of the creature seem to have conceived of it primarily as a striker, as an entity whose essential nature was defined by its capacity to deliver devastating blows with both its boots and its weapons, emphasizing the violent methodology of predation over other aspects of the creature's nature that might have been highlighted through alternative naming conventions. The use of Dunter as a local designation for the Redcap reveals something about how different communities emphasize different aspects of the creature's nature depending on their particular encounters and their particular cultural preoccupations with specific forms of danger and threat. Powrie represents another prominent regional name for the creature, employed particularly in certain areas of the Scottish borders, and carrying associations that suggest a creature that powers through obstacles with relentless force, that crushes and pulverizes whatever stands in opposition to it. The specific etymology of Powrie remains somewhat obscure to modern scholars, though various hypotheses have been proposed regarding its origins and its connections to older Germanic or Celtic linguistic roots that might preserve ancient terminology for predatory beings or for supernatural creatures that inhabited these regions prior to the Christian period. When Powrie appears in historical accounts and in folklore collections, it often seems to be accompanied by descriptions that emphasize the creature's terrible physical strength and its capacity to inflict injuries of particular brutality, suggesting that communities employing this name were preoccupied with the question of raw power and overwhelming force as the primary threat posed by the creature. The distribution of the name Powrie across the borderlands suggests a slightly different geographical range than Dunter, appearing more prominently in areas closer to the central lowlands and reflecting perhaps the influence of different cultural traditions and different folk memory transmission patterns. The existence of these multiple names for what appears to be a fundamentally identical creature raises profound questions about the relationship between linguistic variation and cultural difference, about how the same supernatural phenomenon can be conceived of differently by different communities and assigned different names that emphasize different aspects of its threatening nature. Beyond Redcap, Dunter, and Powrie, various other designations appear in historical records and in the oral traditions of borderland communities. Names that emerge sporadically or that appear to have been employed by only limited numbers of people within specific geographical areas. Some of these names seem to have been lost almost entirely to history, appearing only in the most comprehensive and detailed folklore collections, and no longer maintaining any presence in the living memory of contemporary communities that inhabit the borderlands. Other names persist in attenuated form, remembered by elderly individuals who maintain connection to older folk traditions, but no longer broadly understood or employed within general usage. The fragmentary nature of these secondary designations and their spotty distribution across time and space suggests that local naming conventions for the creature were in constant flux, that new names emerged as different communities encountered the folklore and adapted it to their own linguistic and cultural contexts, while older names gradually faded from active usage as the communities that had generated them dispersed, or as their folk traditions were superseded by alternative narrative frameworks. This pattern of linguistic evolution reveals something profound about the nature of folklore itself, about how it is a living and constantly evolving phenomenon rather than a static and unchanging collection of ancient narratives. The existence of these multiple names across the borderlands serves as testimony to the creature's widespread presence and to the reality of its threat as perceived by communities throughout the region. If the Redcap existed only in a single location, or posed a threat only to a single community, we might expect to find a single standardized name employed universally to refer to it. The proliferation of names across different geographical areas and different temporal periods suggests, instead, that the creature was sufficiently widespread and sufficiently present in the collective consciousness of multiple communities that each community felt justified in employing its own distinctive terminology and in adjusting the emphasis of their descriptions to match local preoccupations and local experiences. The names served practical functions within their communities, functioning as warning signals that could be rapidly understood and immediately recognized by those who heard them, allowing rapid communication about the specific nature of danger and the identity of the threat that had been identified. When a community member warned another about Dunter, the listener would have understood immediately that they were being warned about a creature of overwhelming strength and destructive force, and they would have known to avoid the specific ruined structures that were known to be inhabited by such a creature. The linguistic diversity surrounding the Redcap is therefore not merely an interesting quirk of folk nomenclature, but rather serves as evidence of the creature's profound impact upon the communities of the borderlands and of its integration into local systems of danger identification and threat assessment that were essential to survival in a region where supernatural predators posed a genuine and ongoing threat. To understand the origins of the Redcap, one must necessarily venture backward through centuries of documented history and into the deeper recesses of cultural memory, where the boundary between historical fact and folkloric interpretation becomes increasingly uncertain and permeable. The creature did not simply emerge from nothing, did not manifest abruptly upon the borderlands without antecedent or context, but rather appears to have emerged gradually from the accumulated violence and suffering that characterized the region for generations without number. The Scottish-English border has been contested territory for virtually the entire period of recorded history, a zone where political authority remained fragmented and contested, where the ordinary rules governing settled territories seemed not to apply with the same force and certainty. Across this entire span of time, the border remained a place of violence, a region where raid and counter-raid, where blood feud and systematic warfare, where the constant threat of sudden violence from neighboring territories shaped every aspect of life and consciousness for those unfortunate enough to dwell there. The emergence of the Redcap appears to be intimately connected to this particular character of borderland existence, as though the accumulated weight of centuries of violence and bloodshed somehow catalyzed the transformation of folklore into something far more substantive and threatening than mere narrative. Consider the particular nature of border warfare during the medieval and early modern periods, when conflicts between Scottish and English forces were not merely military engagements between organized state entities, but rather consisted substantially of raids conducted by individual lords and families seeking to expand their territorial control and to accumulate wealth through the seizure of livestock and goods from neighboring communities. These raids were characterized by a particular intensity of violence, by a willingness to employ terror as a deliberate strategic tool, and by a kind of casual brutality that seems almost inconceivable to the modern consciousness, accustomed to certain conventions and limitations regarding the conduct of warfare. When raiders struck a community, they did not restrict themselves to military targets, but rather engaged in the systematic slaughter of civilian populations, burning dwellings and destroying crops, not merely to deprive enemies of resources, but apparently to inflict psychological trauma upon communities that would perhaps never fully recover from the sudden destruction visited upon them. The border regions bore the brunt of this particular style of conflict, experiencing repeated cycles of destruction and recovery that never allowed for genuine stabilization. or for the development of lasting peace and security. Multiple generations passed in a state of perpetual danger, in communities where any night might bring the arrival of raiders and where the most basic question of survival from day to day remained perpetually uncertain. The psychological impact of existing within such conditions of perpetual danger and perpetual violence cannot be overstated, for it shapes consciousness and creates within communities certain patterns of collective belief and shared understanding regarding the nature of danger and the proper response to threats. When violence becomes the normal condition of existence rather than an exceptional occurrence, when danger is not remote but present in daily consciousness, communities develop particular ways of conceptualizing and making sense of the threats that surround them. In such contexts, folklore begins to function not merely as entertainment or as a repository of ancient wisdom, but rather as a practical system for understanding and negotiating threats that cannot be adequately addressed through ordinary means. The Redcap, in this interpretation, represents a folkloric crystallization of the violence that characterized borderland existence, a transformation of human perpetrated cruelty into a supernatural entity that embodies all of the terror and danger that characterize the period. The creature is not a separate phenomenon distinct from human violence, but rather represents a metaphorical extension and an amplification of the violence that human beings were already perpetrating upon one another across the borderlands with terrible regularity and without the restraint of mercy or conscience. This interpretation suggests that the Redcap might be understood not as an intrusion from some supernatural realm separate from the human world, but rather as a manifestation that emerges from the particular conditions of human violence and brutality when those conditions reach a certain critical intensity. In this reading, the creature becomes almost a natural phenomenon, a predictable consequence of the kind of violence and suffering that characterize borderland existence. As though extreme violence creates a kind of wound in the fabric of reality that allows something terrible to grow forth from the wound itself. The notion that places become haunted because of the violence perpetrated upon them is not unique to the Redcap, but appears across many cultures and many traditions of folklore. Places where atrocities have occurred seem to generate supernatural phenomena, generating creatures or presences that bear some relationship to the violence that created them. The Redcap represents an extreme manifestation of this broader pattern, a creature so perfectly adapted to predation and so intimately connected to the violence of its domain that one might question whether it can meaningfully be separated from the violence that generated it, or whether it is simply violence itself taking on visible form and predatory purpose. The chronology of Redcap sightings and the patterns in their distribution across the borderlands offer some support for this interpretation, as the creatures seem to have been most prominent during and immediately following periods of intense border warfare, appearing to manifest most frequently in regions and during epochs when violence was most acute and most widespread. As the border conflicts gradually diminished in intensity during the early modern period, and as central authority gradually extended its reach into previously ungoverned borderland territories, the frequency of reported encounters with redcaps appears to have declined in parallel, as though the creatures were somehow dependent upon the continuation of violent conditions for their manifestation and persistence. This pattern suggests a causal relationship between human violence and the emergence of these supernatural predators, suggesting that the redcap is not an eternal or unchanging feature of the borderlands, but rather a phenomenon that emerges in response to particular historical conditions, and that gradually fades as those conditions are ameliorated. The creature thus becomes not merely a monster to be feared and avoided, but rather a symptom, a manifestation of something deeply wrong in the social and political conditions that generate such violence and suffering on such a scale that they create the conditions for something as terrible as the Redcap to emerge from the very fabric of reality itself. If this interpretation carries validity, then the Redcap represents something far more philosophically troubling than a simple supernatural threat posed by an external creature invading from some other realm. Rather, it suggests that extreme human violence possesses a kind of generative power, a capacity to transform landscapes and to alter the fundamental character of places through the sheer intensity of suffering and bloodshed perpetrated upon them. The creature becomes almost a natural extension of the violence that created it, a predator that emerges from violence and that perpetuates violence in a kind of endless cycle that continues until the original conditions of violence have been sufficiently ameliorated that the creature can no longer find the sustenance and support that allows it to persist in the world of living things. Throughout the historical record of the Scottish borders, there exist scattered accounts of encounters with the Redcap, testimonies from individuals who claim to have survived confrontations with this creature and who lived to report what they had experienced to others within their communities. These accounts, though fragmentary and often recorded long after the events they describe, possess a remarkable consistency in their essential details and in their descriptions of the creature's appearance and behavior, suggesting either genuine encounters with a substantive threat or alternatively a consistent pattern of folkloric transmission that preserved certain core narrative elements across generations and across geographical regions. The recorded encounters form a kind of unofficial archive of interaction between human communities and the Redcap, a collection of survival stories that document patterns of predation and defense, that illustrate the creature's habits and characteristics, and that provide practical information regarding what responses proved effective or ineffective when faced with imminent threat from this particular supernatural predator. To examine these recorded encounters carefully is to gain insight into the lived experience of borderland communities, to understand what specific fears animated their consciousness, and what particular threats they believed themselves to be facing as they went about their daily lives in territories where the Redcap was known to hunt. The accounts also reveal something profound about how folklore functions within communities as a mechanism for processing and understanding dangers that cannot be adequately explained through reference to ordinary natural causes or to common human threats. Among the most detailed recorded encounters are those documented in the later 18th and 19th centuries by folklorists and antiquarians who travelled through the borderlands conducting systematic interviews with elderly community members who retained memory of older traditions and older stories passed down through family lineages. These collectors, motivated by the emerging scholarly interest in folk traditions that characterised the Romantic movement and the subsequent development of folklore studies as an academic discipline, sought out individuals who possessed knowledge of the old stories and who could provide detailed accounts of encounters that their ancestors had experienced or had witnessed. The accounts they collected vary considerably in their specificity and in their level of detail, ranging from brief mentions of the Redcap within more general discussions of supernatural creatures inhabiting the borderlands to elaborate narratives that describe specific confrontations in considerable detail, providing information about the locations involved, the times at which events occurred, and the personal circumstances of those who had experienced encounters. What emerges from the aggregate of these accounts is a picture of a creature that was sufficiently present and sufficiently threatening that virtually every community living in close proximity to its known haunting grounds possessed at least some knowledge of its existence and some understanding of the precautions that should be taken to minimize the risk of encountering it. The consistency with which these accounts describe similar warning signs, similar predatory behaviors, and similar characteristics of the creature suggests either genuine phenomenon experienced repeatedly across the region, or alternatively, a highly effective system of folklore transmission that preserves certain core narrative elements with remarkable fidelity across time and space. One particularly well-documented account, recorded by the antiquarian Robert Surtees in his compilation of border folklore during the early 19th century, describes an encounter that allegedly occurred at a ruined tower in the Central Marches, a location that became notorious in local folk memory as a particularly dangerous haunt of the Redcap. According to the account, a traveller had become lost in the borderlands during the approach of darkness and had sought shelter within the ruin, unaware of its reputation or of the particular threat that dwelling there would expose him to as night fell and the creature became active. The narrative describes with considerable specificity the sequence of events that followed, detailing the initial moments of unease that the traveller experienced as he became aware that something was moving through the ruin with him, the growing sense of dread as sounds began to echo through the structure, and as the traveller gradually realised that he was not alone, but was instead in the presence of something other than human. The account culminates in a description of the confrontation itself, detailing the speed with which the creature moved and the desperate struggle that ensued as the traveller attempted to defend himself against the predator that had been drawn to him by his presence. Most significantly, this particular account goes on to describe the means by which the traveller ultimately escaped death, providing what may be the most detailed historical record of a successful defense against the Redcap. Other recorded encounters describe tragic outcomes in which travelers or local residents who had ventured too close to known Redcap haunting grounds were struck down by the creature and never returned to their homes, leaving only mystery and speculation regarding the precise circumstances of their deaths. These accounts of disappearance and death serve different functions within the folkloristic framework than do the accounts of successful escapes or of confrontations that ended without fatal outcome. They function as cautionary tales that emphasize the genuine danger posed by the creature and that reinforce the collective understanding within communities that certain locations must be avoided and that travel through borderland territories should be undertaken only when absolutely necessary and only with due awareness of the risks involved. The consistency with which particular locations appear in these accounts of disappearance and death suggests that specific ruins maintained a particularly active reputation, that they were known within their surrounding communities as places of special danger where multiple disappearances had been recorded and where the presence of an active Redcap was matter of settled certainty rather than mere speculation or doubt. Communities living in proximity to such dangerous locations appear to have developed systems of warning and observation, establishing practices whereby certain community members would watch for dangerous situations and warn others away from locations that were believed to pose particular risk at certain times of day or during particular seasons, when the Redcap was believed to be particularly active and particularly aggressive in its predatory behavior. The patterns that emerge from careful analysis of the recorded encounters reveal something significant about the nature of the Redcap's interaction with human communities, and about the manner in which folklore functioned as a practical system for managing dangers that could not be adequately addressed through other means. The accounts consistently describe the creature as preferring to hunt individuals or very small groups rather than attacking larger communities or organized groups of travelers, suggesting that the Redcap possesses sufficient intelligence to assess risk and to avoid confrontations likely to result in damage or injury to itself. The accounts similarly indicate that the creature tends to hunt during twilight hours or during darkness, that it rarely, if ever, strikes during the full light of day, suggesting that despite its formidable predatory capabilities, it maintains certain preferences and certain limitations that humans could potentially exploit in constructing defensive strategies. The recorded encounters thus function not merely as entertainment narratives or as expressions of cultural anxiety, but rather as practical documentation of a substantive threat, as accumulations of observational data that allowed communities to develop accurate models of the creature's behavior and to construct strategies that maximize the probability of survival should contact with the Redcap become unavoidable. Throughout the centuries of conflict and terror that characterized the borderlands, communities lived under the shadow of the Redcap's predatory presence with a knowledge that seemed almost axiomatic in its certainty. This creature, formidable as it was, possessed a singular and absolute vulnerability that could be exploited through means entirely independent of physical strength or military capability. The Redcap could not be defeated through conventional weapons, could not be harmed through ordinary violence, and possessed no weakness that related to physical injury or deprivation that a human being might inflict through material means. Yet across the borderlands, a consistent and unwavering tradition held that one method, and one method only, possessed the capacity to repel or entirely destroy this supernatural predator: the invocation of sacred power, the deployment of religious symbols and scriptures that drew upon the spiritual authority of Christian tradition. This singular fact transforms the Redcap from a creature that exists outside the reach of human intervention into one that possesses a specific and identifiable vulnerability, one that any community member could potentially access regardless of their physical strength or martial capability, requiring only knowledge of the appropriate rituals and the courage necessary to perform them in the face of imminent danger. The existence of this vulnerability suggests something profound about the nature of the creature and about the forces that govern its existence and determine the boundaries within which it can operate and persist. The most effective and most consistently documented method of defending against or destroying the Redcap involves the recitation of biblical scripture, particularly passages from the Christian holy texts that possess particular spiritual authority and resonance within the tradition from which they emerge. Those who encountered the Redcap and survived reported that upon beginning to recite scripture with sufficient conviction and spiritual sincerity, the creature would manifest visible signs of distress and would typically retreat from its intended prey, apparently unable to maintain its predatory assault in the face of the spiritual authority invoked through scriptural recitation. The accounts describe the creature responding to scriptural recitation with what can only be interpreted as fear or pain, with manifestations of agitation and distress that suggest the creature experiences scriptural invocation as something fundamentally antithetical to its nature and threatening to its continued existence. Different accounts report varying specific passages as being particularly effective, suggesting that the spiritual authority itself, rather than any specific wording, may be the determining factor in the creature's response and retreat. Communities living in the borderlands appear to have understood this dynamic and to have developed practices whereby certain individuals, particularly those who had received some formal religious education or who possessed particular spiritual authority within their communities, would be called upon in emergencies to perform the ritual of scriptural recitation if a Redcap was encountered and posed immediate threat. The second primary method for repelling or destroying the Redcap involves the presentation of a crucifix or other Christian religious symbol, a visible manifestation of spiritual authority that appears to possess nearly equivalent power to scriptural recitation in terms of its capacity to drive away or to destroy the creature. Historical accounts describe instances in which travelers or residents who possessed crucifixes and who displayed them when confronted with a Redcap found that the creature would recoil from the symbol, would exhibit clear signs of distress, and in some cases would retreat entirely from its intended prey rather than continue its assault in the presence of this religious symbol. The accounts suggest that the power of the crucifix does not reside in its material composition or in any inherent physical properties of the object itself, but rather in what it represents spiritually, in the authority and power that accrues to it through its function as a central symbol of Christian faith and spiritual redemption. Communities in the borderlands appear to have understood this dynamic and to have distributed crucifixes widely among the population, particularly to those individuals who were most likely to find themselves traveling through dangerous territory, or to those who worked in isolated locations where encounter with the Redcap was a genuine possibility. The presence of a crucifix was understood not merely as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical defense against a substantive supernatural threat, an object whose utility was not emotional or psychological, but rather was rooted in a real vulnerability of the creature to the spiritual authority that the crucifix represented. What is most remarkable and most philosophically significant about the Redcap's vulnerability to sacred power is not merely the fact of the vulnerability itself, but rather the nature of its manifestation when the creature is confronted with scriptural recitation or religious symbols. According to consistent accounts across multiple historical sources and multiple regional variations of the folklore, the Redcap does not simply retreat or disappear, but rather vanishes in flames, experiencing what appears to be a catastrophic disintegration or dissolution when confronted with sufficient spiritual authority. The accounts describe flames of supernatural origin surrounding the creature, describe a sudden ignition that seems to consume the creature entirely, and most intriguingly, describe the discovery of a single tooth remaining after the creature has been destroyed by this supernatural fire. This tooth, according to tradition, serves as proof of the creature's existence and as evidence that the encounter that resulted in the creature's destruction was genuine rather than merely the product of imagination or hysteria. The specificity of this detail, the consistency with which multiple accounts reference the discovery of a tooth following the creature's destruction, suggests either a genuine phenomenon with observable and documentable results, or alternatively, a folkloric tradition so well established and so carefully transmitted across generations that every recitation of the story includes this particular detail. The existence of this specific vulnerability raises profound questions about the nature of the Redcap and about the forces that govern its existence and determine the boundaries within which it can operate. If the creature is genuinely susceptible to destruction through spiritual power, if genuine flames of supernatural origin can consume it entirely, then the Redcap cannot be understood as existing entirely outside the realm of spiritual forces, or as being immune to the authority of sacred tradition and religious power. Rather, the creature appears to exist in a complex relationship with spiritual forces, vulnerable to those forces while simultaneously possessing immunity to all physical threats and all material weapons. This suggests that the Redcap, despite its predatory nature and its malevolence, operates according to rules and principles that are not entirely alien to the spiritual framework that governs human religious understanding and practice. The creature stands at the boundary between material and spiritual realms, partaking of properties from both domains while being ultimately subject to the authority of spiritual power, suggesting that whatever forces or conditions generated the creature in the first place may have done so in ways that left it incompletely separated from the spiritual dimensions of reality. The border wars that once ravaged the Scottish-English frontier have long since concluded. The territories have been pacified through the extension of centralized state authority, and the conditions of perpetual violence and instability that once characterized the region have been succeeded by centuries of relative peace and prosperity. Yet despite the transformation of the physical and political landscape of the borderlands, despite the modernization of infrastructure and the integration of these territories into the ordinary life of the contemporary nation-state, the legend of the Redcap persists with remarkable tenacity, continuing to haunt the literary and cultural consciousness of those who maintain connection to borderland folklore and regional tradition. The creature that once posed a genuine existential threat to communities living in isolated castles and scattered settlements has been transformed into a subject of literary fascination, a figure that continues to capture the imagination of writers, scholars, and cultural enthusiasts, even as the conditions that generated its emergence have become historically distant and difficult for contemporary consciousness to fully grasp or understand. The Redcap endures in shadow, not as a living predator demanding blood for the saturation of its crimson cap, but rather as a phantom of cultural memory, as a persistent image that continues to exert psychological and imaginative power over those who encounter it through the medium of written text and scholarly study. This transformation from living threat to literary subject represents a particular kind of survival, a transition that reveals something profound about the nature of folklore and about the mechanisms through which cultures preserve and transmit knowledge across generations, even as the material conditions that originally generated that knowledge have fundamentally transformed. The literary tradition surrounding the Redcap begins in earnest during the 18th and 19th centuries, precisely the period when academic and intellectual interest in folk traditions began to intensify across Europe, and when systematic attempts were undertaken to collect, document, and analyze the folklore of particular regions and particular communities. The Romantic movement, with its idealization of the past and its reverence for popular culture as a source of authentic human experience and primal wisdom, created an intellectual environment in which borderland folklore became increasingly valued as a subject worthy of serious study and scholarly attention. Antiquarians and folklorists began to travel through the borderlands, specifically seeking out those individuals who possessed knowledge of older traditions, conducting interviews and collecting narratives that had been transmitted orally through family lineages and through community practice for generations prior to their documentation in written form. These scholars understood themselves as engaged in a kind of salvage operation, attempting to preserve folklore that they believed was disappearing as modernization advanced and as the conditions of traditional rural life were transformed by industrialization and urbanization. The Redcap, as a central figure within borderland folklore, and as a creature whose mythology had accumulated centuries of narrative elaboration, became a natural focus for this scholarly attention, and a fixture within the early anthologies and collections of British folklore that emerged during this period. As the 19th century progressed, and as folklore studies evolved from the amateur antiquarianism of collectors into a more rigorous academic discipline with established methodologies and theoretical frameworks, the Redcap continued to feature prominently in scholarly discussions of British supernatural traditions and as an exemplar of particular types of folkloric phenomena. The creature appeared in increasingly comprehensive collections of folklore materials, was cited in academic discussions of the relationship between landscape and supernatural belief, and became a standard reference point in scholarly examinations of how communities generate and perpetuate narratives about supernatural threats as mechanisms for processing and making sense of genuine historical dangers. The Redcap's prominence in scholarly literature reflected not merely its intrinsic interest as a folklore subject, but also its utility in illustrating broader theoretical points about the relationship between history and mythology, about how genuine events can become the seeds from which elaborate folkloric traditions grow, and about the complex mechanisms through which communities create and maintain cultural knowledge systems. Scholars examining the Redcap noted the remarkable consistency in descriptions of the creature across different sources and different temporal periods, recognized this consistency as evidence of genuine folklore transmission rather than mere imaginative invention, and used the creature as a case study through which to demonstrate the effectiveness of oral tradition in preserving detailed knowledge across generations and across geographical distances. The 20th century witnessed the emergence of new forms of media that provided alternative vehicles for the transmission and evolution of folklore, creating new contexts in which the Redcap could be encountered and reinterpreted by audiences far removed from the borderlands and distant from the historical circumstances that had originally generated the folklore. The creature began to appear in popular literature, in horror fiction written by authors who had encountered the Redcap through folkloric sources and who sought to adapt and reimagine the creature for contemporary audiences seeking entertainment and psychological excitement. These literary adaptations, while sometimes departing significantly from the traditional accounts in terms of specific details and narrative framing, nonetheless maintained the essential character of the creature and preserved the core elements of its mythology within new contexts and new mediums. The Redcap was referenced in academic studies of horror and the supernatural, was incorporated into encyclopedic compilations of creatures from world mythology and folklore, and became a recognized figure within the broader landscape of English language popular culture, interested in supernatural themes and folkloric phenomena. This expansion of the Redcap's presence into new mediums and new audiences represented both a kind of dilution in that the creature was increasingly encountered in simplified or modified forms, rather than in the detailed and historically grounded accounts preserved by earlier scholarship, and simultaneously a kind of cultural survival, in that the persistence of the creature within popular imagination ensured that the Redcap would not fade entirely into historical obscurity. The contemporary period has witnessed a continued and perhaps even accelerating interest in folklore and supernatural traditions, driven by digital technologies that facilitate the rapid sharing and discussion of cultural materials, and by intellectual currents that emphasize the value of marginalized or neglected cultural traditions. The Redcap has found new audiences through internet forums and websites dedicated to folklore study, has been discussed and analyzed in online communities interested in horror and supernatural fiction, and has been referenced in contemporary creative works that draw upon traditional folklore as sources of inspiration and imaginative material. The creature continues to evolve within contemporary cultural consciousness, continues to accumulate new interpretations and new framings, while retaining sufficient connection to traditional descriptions to remain recognizable and to preserve continuity with centuries of folklore transmission. Yet simultaneously, the Redcap remains fundamentally tied to its historical context and to the particular geographical and temporal circumstances of the borderlands during the medieval and early modern periods, retains its character as a creature whose mythology is intimately connected to genuine historical violence and to real threats that human communities once faced in earnest. The Redcap thus exists in a curious intermediate state, simultaneously a historical phenomenon rooted in a specific time and place, and a contemporary cultural figure whose image and mythology continue to circulate and to evolve within modern media and contemporary imagination. We have journeyed together through centuries of borderland history and through the accumulated layers of folklore and memory that have accumulated around the figure of the Redcap, exploring its nature as predator and as metaphor, understanding its relationship to landscape and violence, and recognizing the ways in which this creature embodies particular truths about the dangers that communities have faced, and about the stories they have created to process and survive those dangers. Yet to conclude our examination of the Redcap without attempting to articulate what this creature might ultimately teach us about ourselves, about the nature of human consciousness and human community, would be to miss the deeper significance that folklore carries, and to reduce these ancient stories to mere entertainment or historical curiosities devoid of contemporary relevance and philosophical weight. The Redcap, properly understood, is far more than a monster to be feared or a supernatural threat to be avoided. Rather, it is a mirror held up to human nature itself, reflecting aspects of our own capacity for violence and our own relationship to the places we inhabit and transform through our actions. The creature becomes a kind of philosophical proposition, a thought experiment through which we can examine fundamental questions about the connection between violence and landscape. about the ways in which human actions reshape the world around us, and about the ultimate consequences of the choices we make as communities and as societies. Consider first the proposition that the Redcap embodies, the notion that extreme violence possesses a kind of generative power, that bloodshed and suffering can literally reshape reality and create new entities and phenomena that did not exist prior to the violence that engenders them. This idea stands in tension with our ordinary understanding of reality as something stable and fixed, independent of human action, and resilient to human influence, except in the most mundane and ordinary ways. Yet the Redcap suggests an alternative vision, a world in which human actions, particularly actions of extreme violence and brutality, carry consequences that extend far beyond the immediate suffering they inflict upon victims in the moment of their perpetration. In this vision, violence is not simply an event that occurs and then passes away, leaving the world unchanged, except for the visible damage it has caused and the harm it has inflicted upon those who were subjected to it. Rather, violence appears capable of creating permanent alterations in the fabric of reality itself, capable of generating phenomena that persist across generations and that continue to threaten and harm human communities long after the original perpetrators of violence have themselves passed into dust. The Redcap emerges from this understanding as a literal manifestation of what violence creates, a being that should not exist in any sane or just universe, but which nonetheless persists because the violence that generated it was sufficiently intense and sufficiently overwhelming to rupture the ordinary barriers that would normally prevent such a creature from manifesting. This interpretation offers a sobering meditation on human responsibility and on the long-term consequences of the choices we make as individuals and as societies. It suggests that violence does not exist only in the moment of its perpetration, but rather leaves traces and consequences that persist and that continue to shape the world we inhabit, long after those who committed the violence have disappeared from memory. The borderlands were transformed by centuries of warfare and bloodshed, and the Redcap represents the ultimate expression of what that transformation wrought, the most extreme possible consequence of communities choosing violence as their primary means of resolving disputes and establishing territorial control. Yet this lesson extends far beyond the specific historical context of the Scottish-English borders. It applies equally to any region where extreme violence has been perpetrated, any territory where human suffering has reached a critical threshold, any place where the accumulation of blood and brutality has been sufficient to create permanent alterations in the character and spiritual essence of the location itself. The Redcap thus becomes a warning to contemporary societies, a message about the long-term consequences of violence and cruelty, a reminder that the harms we inflict do not simply vanish, but rather persist and continue to haunt the places and the communities where such harms have been perpetrated. Beyond this meditation on violence and consequence, the Redcap also teaches us something profound about the nature of fear, and about the ways in which communities create stories and mythologies to process and to survive dangers that they cannot adequately address through material means. The borderland communities that lived under the shadow of the Redcap's predatory presence were genuine communities facing genuine threats, living in regions where violence was not an exceptional occurrence, but rather a normal condition of existence, where danger emanated not only from human enemies, but from something even more terrifying and more incomprehensible than mere human malice. These communities could not defeat the Redcap through weapons or through material force, could not protect themselves through ordinary military means or through conventional strategies of defense and resistance. Instead, they created a mythology, elaborated a system of understanding that transformed their experiences into a coherent narrative framework that allowed them to comprehend and to survive threats that would otherwise have been utterly overwhelming and incomprehensible. The Redcap story provided communities with a language through which to discuss danger, with a conceptual framework through which to understand the threats they faced, and ultimately with a repository of practical knowledge about how to survive and how to resist forces that possessed apparently overwhelming power and apparent immunity to all conventional forms of opposition. This function of folklore as a survival mechanism and as a vehicle for practical knowledge transmission reveals something essential about why stories matter, why mythology persists, and why the narratives that communities create continue to exert power over us even in contemporary contexts, far removed from the historical circumstances that originally generated those narratives. Stories about the Redcap functioned as warnings, as educational tools through which young community members learned about dangers they would face and about strategies that might allow them to survive those dangers. Stories also functioned as a means through which communities processed collective trauma and collective fear, transforming private terror into shared narrative and thereby making that terror more manageable and more survivable through the creation of community knowledge and collective understanding. The persistence of the Redcap legend across centuries and across the transformation of the material conditions that originally generated it testifies to the resilience and power of narrative as a vehicle for preserving and transmitting human meaning and human wisdom. Even now, long after the border wars have concluded and the conditions of perpetual violence have been succeeded by centuries of peace, the Redcap continues to haunt our imagination, continues to offer us insights into the nature of human vulnerability and human resilience, continues to remind us that places remember the violence perpetrated upon them, and that some stories demand to be told and retold across generations. As we conclude this exploration of the Redcap and its place within the vast ecosystem of human folklore and collective imagination, I invite you to reflect upon what this creature represents, not merely as a historical phenomenon or as an interesting example of folkloric transmission, but as a mirror reflecting our own relationship to violence, to landscape, and to the stories we create to make meaning from our experiences of danger and darkness. If you have found value in this exploration of borderland folklore and in the narrative of the Redcap as it has emerged through our examination, I encourage you to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World, where we continue to explore the profound wisdom embedded within the legends and folklore that have shaped human culture across the ages and across the diverse traditions of humanity. The stories we tell matter profoundly, not merely as entertainment or as historical curiosities, but as repositories of wisdom about how to survive, how to resist, and how to create meaning even in the face of forces that appear overwhelming and incomprehensible. The Redcap teaches us this lesson through its very existence, reminding us that darkness can be named, can be understood, and can be resisted through the combined power of knowledge, community, and the spiritual authority that emerges when we stand together against the forces that threaten to consume us.